Welcome to Geo Wars Explained, where every war is not just a story. Disclaimer: this channel provides commentary and analysis on historical and crumbs.
Between September 1980 and August 1988, the border separating Iraq and Iran witnessed the highest concentration of conventional military violence since the Second World War. Over 1 million casualties were absorbed by both nations as entire generations were mobilized into an industrial-scale war of attrition. Yet, when the ceasefire was formally implemented, the internationally recognized boundary between the two states had not shifted by a single permanent millimeter. Conventional historical narratives frequently attribute this absolute strategic paralysis to the ideological fanaticism or personal psychological stubbornness of the respective national leaderships. This localized explanation remains analytically insufficient because it treats a systemic outcome as a mere byproduct of individual ego or irrational statecraft. To properly understand this static outcome, one must discard the conventional emphasis on battlefield heroics or diplomatic maneuvering. The focus must instead shift to how geography, demographics, and global economic systems systematically neutralized every tactical advantage either side attempted to deploy. Both nations engaged in military strategies designed for rapid victories, utilizing mechanized doctrines inherited directly from external Cold War superpowers. However, the operational environment immediately stripped away the efficacy of these doctrines, reducing the conflict to its most basic structural constraints. The lack of territorial change was not a failure of military effort, but a testament to how effectively systems locked two opposing forces into a state of permanent counter-cancellation. The physical geography of the Mesopotamian basin imposed the initial and most immutable constraint upon any attempt at territorial expansion. Iraq's military architecture in 1980 was heavily optimized for armored warfare on flat terrain, directly reflecting Soviet doctrinal influence. The initial Iraqi offensive into Khuzestan relied on the assumption that armored columns could rapidly sever the oil-rich region from the central Iranian plateau. However, the operational terrain consisted of dense networks of rivers, seasonal floodplains, and the extensive marshlands of the Shatt al-Arab waterway. This specific topography naturally channeled mechanized advances into narrow corridors, stripping armored units of maneuverability and rendering them highly vulnerable to static defense. Conversely, any Iranian counter-offensive aimed at the Iraqi political center was immediately neutralized by identical geographic realities. While the flat plains of southern Iraq appeared structurally vulnerable, any Iranian advance had to cross heavily fortified water barriers. These water crossings created fatal logistical bottlenecks, requiring specialized bridging equipment that the isolated Iranian military simply did not possess. Furthermore, the northern sector of the shared frontier was entirely dominated by the Zagros mountain range, acting as a forbidding topographical barrier. This vertical terrain made large-scale troop movements and necessary armored support physically impossible for an army relying on mass mobilization. While geography severely limited operational mobility, massive demographic asymmetry dictated the specific tactical adaptations forcefully deployed by both combatants. In 1980, Iran possessed a population roughly 3 times the size of Iraq, providing a structural advantage that altered the calculus of attrition. For the Iraqi high command, this severe demographic deficit meant that sustaining heavy infantry casualties posed an existential threat to domestic stability. The Iraqi population base could not absorb the continuous loss of fighting-age males without risking a total collapse of the internal security apparatus. To offset this critical vulnerability, Iraq was structurally forced to substitute overwhelming firepower for its glaring lack of available manpower. This reliance on capital-intensive warfare required Iraq to depend heavily on artillery barrages, superior armored formations, and complete air supremacy. Such a doctrine naturally restricted Iraqi forces from engaging in the deep, offensive infantry maneuvers required to permanently pacify hostile urban centers. Offensive operations naturally incur significantly higher casualty rates than static defense, representing a cost that the Iraqi state was mathematically incapable of paying. The demographic constraint therefore precluded Iraq from launching a deep, sustained occupation of the Iranian interior, regardless of its material superiority. Iraqi tactical successes were consistently hollowed out by their inherent inability to garrison the territory they had violently cleared. To dynamically exploit this demographic disparity, Iran adopted a military doctrine that purposefully substituted human capital for a lack of sophisticated hardware. Utilizing highly mobilized volunteer militias, the Iranian military apparatus executed mass infantry assaults meticulously designed to overwhelm Iraqi defensive positions. While these highly costly tactics occasionally breached localized defensive lines, they chronically lacked the mechanized exploitation forces required for deep strategic penetrations. The Iranian infantry could successfully take ground through sheer volume, but without air cover, they could not hold it against concentrated artillery counterattacks. The demographic imbalance ensured that the two militaries perfectly canceled out each other's offensive capabilities, permanently cementing the static nature of the front. This tactical deadlock was further rigidified by the deeply asymmetric nature of the two nations' international logistical supply chains. Following the 1979 revolution, Iran was entirely severed from the Western defense markets that had previously constructed its advanced military infrastructure. The Iranian armed forces were immediately forced to cannibalize their existing inventory and rely on black market networks just to maintain basic combat operations. This severe logistical isolation meant that Iran could not systematically regenerate its mechanized capacity after the initial phases of the war. Any successful Iranian offensive into Iraqi territory naturally exhausted itself the exact moment it outran its fragile and highly fragmented supply lines. In direct contrast to Iran's isolation, Iraq possessed nearly unlimited access to the global arms market, heavily subsidized by external financial credit. The Soviet Union, France, and China continuously supplied the Iraqi military with modern fighter aircraft, main battle tanks, and practically inexhaustible munitions. However, this vast logistical superiority was strictly defensive in its practical application across the contested battlefield. It provided Iraq with the required material density to successfully repel mass assaults, but not the infantry depth to push deep into Iranian territory. The logistical dynamic created an unbreakable cycle where Iranian manpower could initiate an offensive, but Iraqi material abundance mathematically guaranteed its eventual failure. The internal economic architecture of both belligerent states created an inescapable reliance on maritime oil exports to fund their respective war machines. As the land war ground to a predictable halt, the conflict logically expanded into the Persian Gulf, initiating a secondary theater of economic attrition. Iraq actively sought to cripple Iran's war effort by utilizing its superior air force to strike vital oil terminals and target international shipping. Iran responded symmetrically, utilizing fast attack craft and naval mines to harass vessels servicing the critical ports of Iraq's regional financial backers. Because both states relied entirely on petrodollars to purchase military hardware, their capacity to wage war was strictly tethered to the global oil market. The regional geopolitical landscape imposed a rigid, unyielding containment strategy that actively prevented either state from achieving a hegemonistic victory. The Arab states of the Persian Gulf viewed the ideological expansionism of the Iranian Revolution as a direct existential threat. To completely insulate themselves from this ideological contagion, these states functioned as Iraq's dedicated financial hinterland throughout the entire conflict. They systematically injected tens of billions of dollars in interest-free loans to seamlessly sustain the Iraqi domestic economy and fund continuous military procurement. Regional geopolitics dictated that Iraq simply could not be allowed to fail, structurally insulating its borders from overwhelming Iranian demographic pressure. Simultaneously, the broader Cold War architecture maintained a vested, highly calibrated interest in the continuous prolongation of the military stalemate. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union desired an outright victory for either combatant, as the regional balance of power was deemed fragile. An Iraqi victory would unnecessarily strengthen a volatile Soviet client state, while a decisive Iranian victory would directly threaten Western access to vital Gulf energy reserves. Consequently, global intelligence sharing and material support were dynamically adjusted by external powers to ensure mutual exhaustion rather than decisive resolution. The international system functioned as a massive external balancing mechanism, continuously adjusting the weights on the scales of the conflict. As these intersecting structural constraints rendered conventional victory entirely impossible, the conflict devolved rapidly into a fatal escalation trap. Recognizing the absolute impossibility of a permanent territorial breakthrough, both states systematically shifted their targeting parameters away from military formations. They directed their respective arsenals towards civilian population centers, actively attempting to bypass the frozen military stalemate through asymmetric violence. The deployment of chemical weapons by Iraqi forces and the mutual exchanges of ballistic missiles were strictly calculated maneuvers to shatter domestic political will. State planners incorrectly theorized that widespread civilian terror would generate enough internal political pressure to force a favorable renegotiation of the border. This escalation into strategic terror produced the exact opposite political effect, irreversibly locking both regimes into an intractable, uncompromising position. The targeting of civilians directly provided the political apparatuses in both capitals with the necessary external threat to demand absolute domestic unity. Governments effectively utilized the terror to violently suppress internal dissent, transforming the war into a foundational pillar of their own domestic legitimacy. To accept a ceasefire without achieving a tangible territorial gain after subjecting their populations to such warfare would have been politically suicidal. The escalation into asymmetric warfare effectively removed the final option of a negotiated settlement, trapping both armies in an unyielding cycle of attrition. The inevitability of the pre-war territorial status quo was ultimately finalized in the spring and summer of 1988. During this final phase, the accumulated weight of the various constraints collapsed the operational capacity of both states almost simultaneously. Iran's domestic economy, completely suffocated by international diplomatic isolation and drastically diminished oil revenues, could no longer physically function. The state simply lost the financial and logistical capacity to support the basic requirements of its massive volunteer militias on the front lines. Without basic provisions, the Iranian demographic advantage immediately evaporated, leaving their exhausted forces highly vulnerable to conventional mechanized counterattacks. Simultaneously, Iraq launched a series of highly coordinated, mechanized offensives that successfully expelled the remaining Iranian forces from Iraqi territory. Crucially, however, the Iraqi military apparatus deliberately halted its massive advance directly at the recognized international border. The Iraqi High Command explicitly recognized that their military, while capable of reclaiming lost ground, still fundamentally lacked the demographic depth to hold hostile territory. A renewed invasion would simply reset the deadly cycle of attrition, threatening the fragile Iraqi state with total demographic and economic collapse. The viable military options for both nations had been systematically reduced to zero, leaving no further avenues for strategic initiative or political maneuvering. The acceptance of United Nations Security Council Resolution 598 in August 1988 was therefore not a diplomatic triumph, but a mechanical shutdown of two exhausted systems. The borders remained completely unaltered because the conflict was ultimately a rigorous exercise in geopolitical physics, governed by unyielding structural laws. Opposing forces of entirely equal aggregate mass collided violently within a perfectly contained environment, resulting in a perfectly static, highly destructive equilibrium. The 8 years of industrialized violence did not alter the map, it merely validated the rigid, unforgiving security architecture of the region. The Iran-Iraq War stands as a permanent testament to the harsh reality that immense human sacrifice cannot overcome the mechanical equilibrium of a perfectly balanced geopolitical system.
Subscribe for channel for new updates.